Welcome to Twilight Fables, where the fairy tales you thought you knew take on a darker shade. Tonight, we tell of a craftsman who prayed for help and received it, though not from the heavens, but from the hollows of his own hands. This is the Shoemaker and the Elves, the midnight stitchers. The lamplight in Elias's workshop was little more than a trembling heart. It beat upon the scraps of leather and dull tools, like a pulse fading beneath a bandaged hand. Outside, snow pressed against the small window, muffling the sounds of the dying street. The old town had long ago stopped buying fine shoes. The factory had come, the new, loud thing at the edge of the city that spat out boots by the dozen. And what need did anyone have for craftsmanship anymore? Elias still worked. He always worked. His wife, Marta, watched from the doorway. She did not know what to say anymore. Every evening, the man she loved sat at his bench until his shoulders curled like wilted leaves, until his hands shook too badly to thread a needle. He'd they'll rest a moment, drink what little ale they had, and begin again. He was kind, her husband, always kind. That made it harder to watch him sink. "You'll lose your sight," she said softly, though she knew the words would drift past him like dust motes. He murmured something without looking up. "Not yet," she thought she heard. "Not while they still need me." The "they" was vague. Sometimes he meant the customers, other times the shoes themselves. The candle died around midnight. Elias had been cutting leather for one final pair, and his trembling hands had sliced the pattern unevenly. He stared at it, hollow with exhaustion. "It's no good," he whispered. "All wrong." He closed his eyes. His body ached, his breath shallow. He pressed his palms together and whispered, not quite a prayer, more a plea. "If there's anyone left who still loves the work, who still remembers the craft, help me." Then he stumbled to bed, leaving the cut leather on the bench. When morning came, the workshop smelled of polish. Marta woke to the sound of her husband gasping. She ran to him and found him standing over the bench, staring at something as if it were a holy vision. The shoes were finished, perfect. Fine seams, even stitches, smooth soles. They gleamed faintly in the dawn light. Elias touched them as though afraid they might vanish. "Marta," he said hoarsely, "look at the stitching. I didn't do this. Someone help me." She frowned. "Who could have?" "You locked the door." "The elves," he said, voice trembling with a strange mixture of awe and laughter. "The old tales were true. The elves have come." Marta smiled gently. He had always loved stories like that. "If that's so," she said carefully, "then you're blessed." He nodded, eyes bright. Blessed. That day, the shoes sold within an hour. The merchant who bought them offered double the usual price, saying they were as if spun by angels. Elias bought more leather that evening. That night, again, he cut the patterns and left them out. He whispered a soft thank you to the empty room and went to bed early, exhausted but hopeful. When morning came, the shoes were there, 2 pairs this time, each stitch, each thread, flawless. Martha felt the hairs rise on her arms. She had not heard a sound all night. No hammering, no scraping, only the wind against the glass. Elias, however, fell to his knees. "They're real," he whispered. "They truly are." As the days passed, the miracle continued. Each night, Elias would cut the leather and set out his tools. Each morning, the shoes appeared. He began to leave tiny gifts: a thimble, a scrap of velvet, a crust of bread. For the elves, he said. Martha found it endearing at first, even sweet. His smile had returned, and she couldn't bear to ruin it with scepticism. But small things began to trouble her. Sometimes she would wake in the deep hours and find the bed empty. Once she heard a faint, rhythmic tapping from below. Another time, a low hum, like someone singing through clenched teeth. When she asked, he only laughed. "Checking on them," he said. "They like company." His hands grew rougher, his fingernails blackened with polish and blood. Yet he insisted the elves did all the work. "They must be proud of me," he told her, voice trembling with gratitude. "They make more each night." Martha tried to tell herself it was fatigue, that he simply didn't remember. But then, one night, she found his candle burned nearly to nothing, the wax pulled in shapes, like fingertips. He had written a note beside his tools. "To my friends of midnight, you have given me hope. I will not fail you." The words were written in his own hand, but the letters were uneven, jagged, as though someone else had guided it. When snow thawed and spring began to show its bones, Elias was already working faster, longer. He no longer waited for the elves. He worked beside them, or so he said. "There's no need for me to sleep," he told Martha. "They keep me company. They whisper how to sew the soul stronger, how to make the seams so fine they'll last a lifetime." She watched his eyes as he said it. There was fever in them, worship. That night, as he laid the leather out, he touched it with reverence. "They'll be happy tonight," he murmured. "I can feel them waiting." Martha did not sleep. She lay awake, listening. For a long time there was silence. Then the soft scrape of a chair, a faint clink, the sigh of a man too tired to rest. She pulled her shawl tight and crept down the narrow stairs. The light from the workshop door bled under the threshold, flickering like something alive. Inside, Elias sat hunched over the table, bare to the waist, his skin slick with sweat. His hands moved with eerie precision, needle through leather, thread pulling taut, stitch after perfect stitch. He was humming, but the tune was off, strange, circular, as though repeating words she could not hear. Martha froze. He was awake, and yet his eyes were open too wide, unseeing. His movements were mechanical, relentless. The candle burned low, the flame trembling with each pull of thread. She took a step forward, whispering his name. He did not answer. The sound of the needle striking the bench was the only reply. When he finally collapsed, the shoes were done, beautiful and silent, gleaming faintly red where the light caught them. Marta touched one and pulled her hand back. It was warm. Elias stirred, blinking as though waking from a dream. When he saw the shoes, he smiled, serene. "They came again," he said softly. "Did you see them? My friends." Marta's throat closed. She nodded, tears welling. "Yes, love," she whispered. "I saw them." He smiled, content. "Good. They said they'd stay as long as we needed them." Outside, dawn crept up the street, painting the frosting gold. In the window, the shoes gleamed like something holy. Inside, Marta stood watching her husband's sleeping form, the candle guttering beside him. She could still hear the faint echo of his voice. "They'll stay as long as we need them." She didn't yet understand what that promise meant, but soon she would. The morning light never felt the same after that night. Marta kept glancing toward the window of the workshop, where the faint shapes of shoes and boots lined the sill like a row of open mouths. Elias called it a blessing, a miracle for the faithful, but she had seen what those miracles cost him. His fingers trembled now when he ate, the nails bruised and split. He said the elves worked through him sometimes to make the craft swifter. She did not argue. It was better to let him have his comfort. And yet, each evening, as he prepared his bench and laid the leather out with such reverence, a sickly dread gathered in her chest. The fear that one night he would simply not stop. The shoes sold faster than he could make them. People came from neighbouring towns. The merchant who once underpaid him now bowed when he entered. They called Elias blessed by the little folk, and he glowed at their praise. He had begun to whisper to the shoes themselves, to pat them gently, as though soothing children. He claimed he could hear them whisper back when no one else was listening. "They're grateful," he told her one evening. His face was pale, almost translucent in the lamplight. "They said they remember kindness. That's why they came to us." Marta forced a smile. "Of course, dear, you've always been kind." He looked up at her, blinking as though surprised. "You hear them too?" There was a pause. His gaze was pleading, desperate for her to share the faith. Marta swallowed. "Sometimes," she said, "at night, when the wind moves the shutters." He smiled, relieved, and reached for her hand. His palm was cracked and warm. "Then we're both blessed," he whispered. She began to notice little things. When he worked, he sometimes bled into the leather, tiny spots that vanished into the dye. His lips moved, soundless, murmuring in some rhythm she didn't know. Once she found him kneeling before the table, whispering thanks to the empty space above the shoes. Another time, she found a line of small, dark footprints across the workshop floor. Not tiny, as a child's might be, but narrow and adult, barefoot. The pattern was so precise, it almost looked intentional. When she called to him, Elias said he'd dreamed of their dance and gone down to leave them room. Marta began locking the bedroom door at night, though she wasn't sure why. Spring came late that year, and when it did, it brought more business than ever. Elias stopped sleeping altogether, working through the nights, stopping only when he collapsed mid-stitch. Marta pleaded with him to rest. "They'll leave if I stop," he murmured, his eyes red-rimmed and glassy. "They said I must keep the craft alive, that I'm the last who remembers the old ways." "Elias," she said softly, "you are the elves. You've done all this yourself." He laughed, almost kindly. "That's what they tell me too, when they want to trick me into resting." It was late one evening when she decided she had to know the truth. Elias had fallen asleep for once, his breath shallow, his hands bandaged. She crept down the stairs, clutching a small lamp. The workshop smelled of oil and leather and something else, metallic and sour. On the bench lay the new pair he'd been making. They gleamed as always, but up close the thread was darker than usual, almost black. She touched it, and her finger came away with a faint red stain. Her stomach twisted, the lamp flickered, and for a moment she thought she saw movement, a shadow scurrying along the edge of the wall. She turned quickly, heart pounding, but the room was empty. Only the ticking of the old clock and the soft sound of the wind against the shutters. Then she looked down. A trail of small, smeared footprints led away from the table. Not dry dust this time, but dark, wet prints, glistening faintly in the light. They led toward the back door. She followed them, trembling, and found it slightly ajar. Beyond it, the yard was covered in frost, undisturbed except for one set of barefoot tracks that vanished into the snow. Her hand shook. She closed the door and barred it. When she returned to bed, Elias was gone. When he came back, it was almost dawn. His eyes were wide, his face hollow. "They danced tonight," he whispered. "They wanted me to join them, but they said I mustn't. Not yet." He was barefoot, his feet were raw. Marta said nothing. She simply took his hand and led him back to bed. That morning, she decided what she would do. She spent the day sewing, not shoes, but garments, tiny shirts, vests, and small boots. Her hand shook, but she kept at it, pricking her fingers until drops of blood marked the hems. When Elias asked what she was doing, she smiled faintly. "Gifts," she said, "for your friends." He blinked. "For the elves?" "Yes, so they can rest. You've done so much for them, love. It's time they were free." He nodded slowly, as though the thought were new and wondrous. "Free," he repeated, the word fragile in his mouth. That night, she laid the little clothes out on the bench. Elias wept when he saw them. "You're so kind," he said, voice shaking. "They'll be so happy. I can feel them watching already." He touched the small garments reverently, brushing his fingers along each seam. "Look," he whispered, "they've left something for me." Marta frowned. "What?" He pointed to the shoes, a new pair, small and perfect, sitting atop the table. "They've made me their brother." She smiled weakly. "That's wonderful." But her heart turned cold as he lifted the garments she'd sewn and began putting them on himself. He pulled the small shirt over his head, tearing it at the seams. The fabric stretched over his shoulders, the stitches snapping one by one. He laughed softly as though tickled. Then the vest, the tiny boots. He forced his feet into them, grimacing with pleasure, whispering words she couldn't understand. "Elias, stop," she began. He looked up at her, smiling. "They fit," he said simply, "perfectly." And then he sat at the bench, half dressed in the doll-like garments, and began to sew again, humming that same circular tune. Marta backed away slowly, tears in her eyes. He didn't look up. The sound of the needle striking the wood echoed long after she left the room. When dawn came, the bench was covered in shoes, too many to count. Elias sat slumped in his chair, still wearing the tattered, blood-stained miniature clothes. Marta touched his shoulder gently. His skin was cold, but his lips moved faintly. "They're free now," he whispered. "All free." The town would later say that night was the most beautiful they had ever seen. The shoemaker's window glowed bright as a star until sunrise. They said the elves had danced their farewell. Only Marta knew better. Only she knew what it had cost him to let them go. The bell above the shop door chimed again and again that winter. Customers came in with orders, smiling and grateful, their boots snug and perfect. Word of the shoemaker's miraculous work had spread beyond the village. They said his craftsmanship had a touch of the otherworldly, that perhaps the elves truly were back among men. The shoemaker smiled at such talk. He would nod politely, eyes bright with sleepless wonder, and promise their orders would be ready by dawn. Then, when the sun went down and the fire crackled to embers, he locked the door and the whispers began. At first, they were only scraps of sound, the faint brushing of cloth, the clink of metal, the rhythm of thread pulled through leather. He'd close his eyes and listen, smiling in quiet awe. The elves were working again. He would light a candle and peer around the shop, seeing only the shadows of the benches, the sewing table, and the pile of half-finished boots. But as he stood there long enough, the air shimmered faintly, and in that shimmer he saw them, tiny figures, small, pale things with quick hands and thin arms. They darted about the room, laughing soundlessly as they cut patterns, stitched soles, and polished the finished shoes with trembling fingers. They looked like children, though their faces were oddly blurred as though stitched from dream cloth. Their laughter echoed through the wood and air like needles scraping glass. "Bless you," the shoemaker whispered, voice thick with emotion. "Bless you for helping me." He didn't see his wife in the doorway, watching him. She saw no elves, only her husband hunched over the table, eyes fever bright, murmuring to himself while he stitched and stitched, his fingers bleeding through the thread. The firelight danced across his bare shoulders. He had stripped off his clothes hours ago, working in a trance, his thin body slick with sweat. He spoke softly, as if to invisible friends, and she stood there, frozen in the dark, clutching her nightgown to her chest. The next morning, she tried to speak to him. "You've been working so hard, dear," she said gently. "You must rest a little, please." But he only smiled faintly. His eyes were distant, fevered. "They came again, my love. The elves. They're good to me, you see. So small and humble. I cannot let them work naked any longer. It's not right. They deserve clothes, warm and fine, to show my gratitude." The wife's throat tightened. She knew what she had seen. There were no elves, only her husband, trembling, hunched, his body half-starved and mind unravelling. But something in his expression frightened her more than madness itself. He looked blessed, so that night, while he finally slept, twitching and murmuring in his dreams, she set to work. She sewed tiny shirts and trousers, caps and stockings, each no larger than a doll's outfit. She stitched by candlelight until dawn, her tears wetting the cloth. When the shoemaker awoke, he found the little garments laid out on the workbench. His heart leapt. "Oh!" he cried, voice trembling with joy. "How thoughtful! How perfect! The elves shall have clothes. My dear, they will be so happy. They will see how grateful I am." He bundled the garments in his hands and placed them by the door. Then, as the clock struck midnight again, he waited, and in the shimmer between the candles, they appeared once more. But this time, the elves didn't laugh. They stood still, silent, their blurred faces tilted toward him. The little clothes he had offered them were gone, vanished without a trace. In their place, he found scraps of fabric scattered across the floor, torn and shredded. Still, he smiled. "You like them," he whispered. "I knew you would." Behind him, his wife awoke to the faint sound of humming, a lullaby, slow and cracked, drifting from the workshop. She crept to the door again and looked in. He was there, as always, naked, shaking, his hands blackened with dye and blood. He was stitching something, but she couldn't see what. His lips moved soundlessly, repeating the same words again and again. "Thank you, little ones. Thank you for your gift." On the table before him lay not shoes, but a pile of cloth shaped like small bodies, little torsos, heads, and arms made of leather and thread. Her breath caught. She stepped back, hand trembling over her mouth. When dawn came, the shoemaker slept peacefully in his chair, smiling faintly. The little leather forms were gone. The floor swept clean. He told her the elves had come to bid him farewell, that they had danced in their new clothes until the stars faded. They won't come again, he said, eyes shining. They've gone home now, but oh, how blessed I am to have seen them. His wife said nothing. That night, she dreamed of the workshop, but it wasn't a dream. She awoke to the faint sound of a needle pulling through skin, steady and rhythmic, and somewhere in the dark, something whispered, "We are still here."